Okay, it is 11 a.m. Thank y'all so much for coming to the Let's Talk 2020 Census presentation today. My name is Francesca Perez Evans, and I am the Community Engagement Librarian at the Government and Heritage Library with the State Library of North Carolina, as well as your host. The Government and Heritage Library's mission is to preserve and facilitate public access to state government information and to advance the study, understanding, and appreciation of North Carolina's cultural heritage, to provide library resources and services that support the operational needs of state government agencies. We are also a coordinating agency of the State of North Carolina Data Center. We are so excited to have Bob Koch, North Carolina's Governor's Census Liaison, have a Q&A and talk all things 2020 Census with our moderator, Beth Hayden. As of right now, the 2020 Census rate, self-response rate for North Carolina is only at 57.1%, with time to still respond. By the end of this webinar, we hope you have the information you need to fill it out yourself or encourage other North Carolinians to make NC count. Before we get started, let's go over some housekeeping. If you have any questions during the presentation, please type your questions and comments in the chat box. You can access the chat box by hovering on the toolbar and click the chat icon and a chat box will appear. Audience questions will be answered at the end of the presentation. Also, today's presentation will be recorded and available online. Now, with further ado, please let me introduce our presenters. Bob Koch serves as the Governor's Census Liaison and Coordinator of the North Carolina State Data Center Network. State Data Center Network is a partnership between the United States Bureau and 45 affiliate organizations throughout North Carolina. He also leads the 2020 Census Working Group for the North Carolina Geographical Information Coordinating Council. Mr. Coates has worked in data analysis with state government for over 25 years. And prior to working with state government, Mr. Coates worked at the Raleigh News and Observer newspaper. Bob is also a North Carolina native and a graduate of North Carolina State University. Let me introduce our moderator, Elizabeth Hayden. In 2008, Elizabeth Hayden began her career with the State Library of North Carolina as a demographic librarian, assisting the North Carolina State Data Center to answer questions related to data, as well as providing training for data retrieval tools such as LINK. Currently, Mrs. Hayden is the Reference Resources Supervisor at the Government and Heritage Library and is considered a research expert on North Carolina information. So let's get started with our Q&A. Please welcome Bob and Beth.
Thank you, Francesca, and thank you for having us here.
Thank you, Francesca.
Let's get started. Bob, why should I complete the 2020 census during this pandemic?
That's a great question, Beth, and it's actually two questions. So first of all, you should respond to the census because this is something that only happens once every 10 years, and it sets the foundation for our data planning and our service providing as a state and for local governments for the next decade. So the census is required by the Constitution to be done every 10 years on a year ending in 0 for apportioning seats in the House of Representatives. And North Carolina is in good shape to get at least one more seat in the House if we do a good job of counting everyone in the state. Secondly, because this is the biggest picture that we get of who our communities are, the census is used to drive an awful lot of federal and state funding. In North Carolina right now, that ends up being about $1,623 per person per year in federal funding and about $200 per person per year in state funding. So that's your tax dollars that have already been paid, and by being counted on the census, you bring those resources back to serve the needs of your neighborhood, of your community. That's things like schools, highways, infrastructure. So with a state that's growing as much as North Carolina is, we're growing by about a net 100,000 people a year. That's about the size of Wilmington every year. So we need to know where we need extra water, sewer, electricity, where our highways need to be expanded. And the census data gives us that information. The other part to this is a lot of our local governments need this information to determine how to plan for future growth, for future development, not only demographic growth, but also economic growth. A lot of businesses look at the census data to determine what their labor force looks like, what their market looks like. So being counted on the census helps make sure that you have the goods and services and resources that you need for the next decade. So that's the importance of the census. The pandemic side of things, we obviously want to make sure that everyone is safe and healthy during this time. And this is the first census that allows people to use the internet to respond. So you can go online right now from the safety and security of quarantine. Go online to my2020census.gov, fill out your information. It's very quick. And the sooner you complete your census form, the more likely it is that a census worker will not have to visit your house for non-response follow-up. If you don't have internet access or you'd rather not use the internet, you can also call online. That phone number is 844-330-2020. That's the English language line, but there are phone services in 12 different languages, including Spanish. So you can visit the website, the census website, to find those other phone lines. Or you can also fill out the traditional hard copy questionnaire. The important thing is the sooner you're counted, in whichever way you choose, the more likely you are that you won't be visited by a census worker, and you'll be maintaining that social distance.
Okay. Well, how do I know that my personal information will not be shared?
That's a great question and an important one. The U.S. Census Bureau is part of the U.S. Department of Commerce, and they operate under federal guidelines, federal regulations. The Title 13 of the U.S. Code states that your personal information, census information for yourself or your household, cannot be shared with anyone, not law enforcement, the courts, the IRS, immigration, not even your parents, for 72 years. Any violation of that confidentiality is punishable by 5 years in federal prison, $250,000 fine, or both. So the Census Bureau takes your confidentiality very seriously.
How are people counted who do not have a home?
That's a good question. As I mentioned, North Carolina is growing by a net 100,000 people a year. So that's a lot of people moving in the state. It's also a lot of people moving within the state. So the census challenge is to count everyone once, only once, and where they usually live. But there's a lot of variety in how people live. So obviously people who live in a home or an apartment or a townhome are going to receive questionnaires in the mail or invitations to participate online. But homeless populations or people who are more mobile, maybe people that live in marinas at the coast, those people will also be counted. The operation to count the homeless population is known as the service-based enumeration. And as we were just talking about with COVID, the impact of COVID has impacted the census timeline on a lot of these operations. So the census is still going on. It's still important that everyone be counted, but the timeline has shifted. So if you haven't already been counted, you now have until October 31st to be counted. Sooner's better than later. And the service-based enumeration operation to count the homeless population has been delayed. We don't know exactly when it's going to happen now, but it happens over usually a 3 to 4 day period where census workers visit places that provide services to the homeless population. Soup kitchens, homeless shelters, churches, and also during that time period, they go out into the field, into the communities with service providers in an attempt to count the homeless population that are visible in the streets. So everyone counts, even the homeless population, even new migrants into our state, everyone counts, but the challenge is making sure that we get everyone counted.
Okay. Well, I live in a rural area. Why does it matter if I fill out the census?
Everyone counts to the census, whether you live in the middle of a big city, whether you live in a rural area, whether you're homeless. Everyone counts, no matter your age too. So if you're a newborn baby or if you're 100 years old, everybody counts. In rural areas, that funding amount that we talked about earlier still applies. So you're being counted on the census brings that $1,800 of your tax dollars back to your community to serve the needs of your community. If you choose not to be counted, if you don't fill out your census form, your tax dollars go to some other community. And as we also mentioned, if you're not counted, your county commissioners, your local service providers, your local volunteer fire department, emergency management people, they don't know that you're there. They don't have the data that says, oh, this person is here and this is the needs of our community. So being counted in the census, it's a big federal operation, but the importance of it is really local. So you participate in the census because it helps your community.
My grandmother lives in an assisted living community. Does she get counted?
Absolutely. Everybody counts. In assisted living communities, as again, is one of those housing situations that we talked about a little while ago. A group quarters is the census term for any housing situation where a lot of people live in this location, but they may usually or they may have a residence somewhere else. These include things like nursing homes, college dorms, military barracks, prisons. All of these are group quarters, but everyone in those group quarters counts for the census. So there is a group quarters enumeration process where the Census Bureau, beginning in February, reached out to group quarters and asked how they would like their populations counted. There are three main options. The first one was e-response, where the administrative staff of the group quarters could provide the information electronically. The other option was a paper list where they could provide a spreadsheet of the information for their residents to the Census Bureau. The third option was called a drop-off pickup option, where census workers would actually bring questionnaires to the group quarters, drop those off with the group quarters staff and have them distribute the questionnaires, and then come back later and pick them up. That operation was impacted by COVID because field operations were suspended for about 2 to 3 months, and they're just starting back right about now. So for some group quarters, because that field operation was suspended, they haven't received their census information yet, but they are right about now. So yes, everyone in a group quarters counts, but they might be counted in a different way.
Okay. Well, I have a family member in the military living overseas. Will you miss them?
No, everyone counts. It's a difficult situation in counting overseas folks. So only the overseas federal population and their spouses. So if you work for an American embassy or if you're in the military and you're stationed overseas, you'll be counted through administrative records. So the military overseas station population will be counted because the Department of Defense has information on the service members that are overseas. They'll provide that to the Census Bureau, and those populations will be counted to their home state, but not to any city, county, or town within that state, but they will be counted.
Okay. Well, I live in a new apartment complex. How did you find me?
Well, the census, it sounds like something that only pops up once every 10 years, but it takes an awful lot of preparation to get ready for the census. Local governments have been preparing and providing information to the Census Bureau for about 4 to 5 years now, just to get ready for 2020. That includes local address lists. So local governments had the opportunity of partnering with the Census Bureau to look at the address list that the Census Bureau had for their homes, and then filling in any gaps that were there. There's also a new construction program that happened right before the census began to say, here are all the new houses that were built, new addresses that were created in our communities. So all of these were an effort to make sure that the Census Bureau knew of all the addresses where people could live. The Census Bureau, when they mailed out their questionnaires, they don't mail the questionnaires to an individual, they mail them to an address without making any assumption that anyone lives at that address. So your apartment address was on the mailing list and you got a questionnaire through that. And if nobody lives in the apartment, then no one responds.
Okay. What if I decide not to fill out the census form?
Well, the census, your response to the census is actually required by federal law. So if you received your mailing in the mail, on the front of the envelope, it says your response is required. So if you do not fill out the census questionnaire online, by phone, or on the paper form, The census workers will begin going door to door in an operation called non-response follow-up, or NRFU. That starts because of COVID, it's been pushed back. It will start in August 11th, and run through October 31st. So this is the traditional idea that a lot of folks have of the census worker knocking on doors and asking the same questions that are actually on the questionnaire. Now, I do want to point out here, and it's an important thing to bring up, we want to make sure that people aren't taken advantage of and that frauds don't happen. So all the census workers that are in the field doing this work will have an ID badge with their picture and their name on it and the watermark of the U.S. Census Bureau. They'll be carrying a large bag with the U.S. Census Bureau logo on it. If you ask them, they will provide you a letter with the Census Bureau letterhead saying, yes, I am an official census worker. So they'll be clearly identified. It's also important to know what the census will not ask. The census will never ask about, it's not asking about citizenship. They're never going to ask information about your social security number or a bank account number. They're not going to ask for any cash or donations for any political party. So none of that will happen because of the census. It's also important to note that the census workers will be wearing PPE, at least initially, because of COVID. So they may have masks and they may be wearing gloves and hand sanitizer, but they will be clearly identified.
Can I get help filling out the census? Who can I get to help me fill it out?
That's a great question. So originally the Census Bureau had planned on having field workers that were going to be available at public places like public libraries to assist people with questionnaires. However, COVID has impacted that plan too, and a lot of the public libraries and public places may not be open yet. So that's impacting things. You can always use the toll-free number to go in and have a census worker help answer any questions you have. Again, that phone number is 844-330-2020, and that's the English language line. But again, there are phone numbers for at least 12 different languages, and there's language support in over 70 different languages. It just may be hard copy. So if you have questions, there are people that are staffing those phone lines to answer them. Call at any time.
What can I do to get other people to fill out their form?
Talk to your neighbors. This is a big federal operation. In fact, it's the biggest peacetime mobilization the United States does. And because of that, it's intimidating to a lot of people. So what we really need right now is trusted local voices, people that you see in the grocery store, where maybe your children play soccer together, but people that you know and trust to say, this is important to our community, and I'm participating because I want to make sure that our community gets appropriate funding and appropriate representation. Now, there's some great resources online through the North Carolina Complete Count Commission. That commission was established by Governor Cooper in October of 2018, and the website is census.nc.gov. There's some great things that you can print out. There's some great ideas that you can use to spread the word. If you have a listserv of you and your neighbors and you want to drop in a quick article, there's an article there that you can grab and drop in. If you've completed your census form and you're still quarantined, there's a sign that you can print out and stick in your window to let your neighbors know that you've done your part. There's even a black and white sign there that if you have children who are at home and they're bored with being quarantined, they can color in the sign and stick that in the window just to let friends and neighbors know that you've done your part. So it can be as simple as, number one, fill out your form. Number two, let your neighbors know that you've done it and your friends and family members, or put a sign up. But even just doing the easy stuff about talking to people that you bump into, letting them know that it's important, reminding them that with all the news that's going on about COVID and other things, the census is still going on and it's still important.
Well, when can I see the result of the count?
Once again, COVID has been working here. So originally, by law, the Census Bureau was required to have total state populations from the census on the president's desk no later than December 31st of this year, with redistricting data released in April of 2021. Because of COVID, the Census Bureau has asked Congress to relax those deadlines so that the apportionment data, the total state population figures, will come out in April, with the redistricting data coming out in July of 2021. Congress has not ruled yet, so the request is out there. A bill has been filed, but they have not officially ruled. So right now, they're still under the official December and April release dates, but that may well change.
Okay. When will I be able to use the 2020 census for family history research?
Good question. And it relates back to the confidentiality answer that we had a little while ago. So the 72 years confidentiality is what limits when the genealogy data will be released. So right now, the most current census data that you have for genealogy purposes is the 1940 census because of the 72-year rule. So in 2022, the 72 years will have passed since the 1950 census, and that will be released in 2022.
Okay. Well, what does the Census Bureau do in between censuses?
You know, a lot of people hear Census Bureau and they think that, well, it's just something that happens once every 10 years. But the Census Bureau conducts over 80 different surveys. Some of those surveys are actually monthly, some are annually, some are quarterly. They measure everything from the demographics of the population, age, race, sex, to socioeconomic information, family households, non-family households, economic information, per capita income, educational attainment. They also measure information on the business communities. So the economic census happens every 5 years. The county business patterns report business activity at the county level every year. And during the COVID outbreak, they have produced some new surveys, the Household Pulse Survey, to show the impact of COVID on household incomes and living situations, how many people have lost jobs, what's been the impact of COVID. Not only have they been measuring that impact on households, but they've also been measuring that impact on small businesses. So the Census Bureau is really the statistical entity of the federal government, and it produces an awful lot of information throughout the decade.
Okay.
Well, thank y'all so much for working or answering those like kind of questions to get us started and have like a more conversation about what is going on with the 2020 census. We had a question in chat about what are the timeline adjustments related to the census from COVID-19. We kind of talked a little about when it's going to be released. Is there any more information about how much time we have, or are they still working on that?
Yeah, there have been a lot of adjustments. So we mentioned with the group quarters count that if group quarters decided that they were going to respond through e-response or the paper list, that operation actually is going on right now, and it will run through September. For those folks that needed an in-person group quarters count, that will be starting in July and running through September as well. For the general population, for everybody out there, you have until October 31st to fill out your census form in any way that you choose to do that. The non-response follow-up that I mentioned, that's where the census workers will begin going door to door and trying to make sure that everyone's been counted. That will start August 11th and run through October 31st. And there are some special operations. We mentioned the service-based enumeration to count the homeless population. The dates for that haven't been reset because of COVID, but they will be happening. I think the one thing that we need to be paying attention to, especially in rural North Carolina, is an operation called Update Leave. I mentioned this is the first census that you could use the internet to respond, but estimates show that about 700,000 households in North Carolina don't have internet access at home. And a lot of those tend to be in rural areas. So for those areas, census workers were going to be, a lot of those areas have P.O. Box mail delivery instead of the regular street style, city style address delivery. So in those areas, the census workers were going to go out and hang questionnaires on doorknobs because the Census Bureau doesn't mail through P.O. boxes. Because of COVID, that operation was suspended. So many parts of rural North Carolina did not receive their questionnaires yet. The North Carolina area census offices just opened in mid to late May, and census workers are going out into the field right about now. So you should be seeing census packets being hung on doorknobs now for those people. And when you get those packets, you'll have the opportunity to respond right away. You have until October 31st, but respond sooner rather than later, and a census worker won't visit your home.
Great, thank you. And so we're going to move on to some of the questions that were asked through our registration question that we asked when we did registration. So We kind of have a lot of these questions that are coming in about they want to improve the response rate for this 2020 census, but there's a lot of residents that do not trust government. They don't trust strangers. They just really, they don't trust the technology, or they don't have access to the technology. So how can we make these residents feel comfortable, and how can we like work with governments and in partnerships with like census field supervisors, identifying like locations and towns that people can go to get assistance for these events, or assistance to fill out the census?
That's a big question. There's a lot in that.
Yeah.
So first of all, the Census Bureau has a couple of resources that you can take a look at now. These are resources that have been available for over a year. One of them is there are hard to count population maps, HTC. And these hard to count populations are based on the Census Bureau's experience of past censuses. They recognize there are a couple of factors that make people more difficult to contact. And they have maps at sub-county levels showing you where there are higher concentrations of those communities. So there are complete count committees that have been formed across the state to try to reach out to those communities. But really anybody can take a look at those maps and see, okay, well, we have concentrations of seniors in this area. We have concentrations of very young children in this area. The under 5 population is one of the largest undercounted populations in the nation. So even households that have filled out their census may not necessarily count the kids that are there. So we want to make sure the parents know that all the children count. We also know that people who are experiencing poverty are missed at a higher rate. So if we have areas of concentrations of poverty, we really need to be working through organizations that serve those communities, maybe Meals on Wheels, other operations that provide services, food banks and things like that, can have flyers that we distribute to folks who use those services. Examples of that kind of information are available at census.nc.gov through the outreach toolkit. So take a look at some of that. A big issue that we're having with our response rates right now, I mentioned that the update leave operation had been suspended. So we do have pockets of North Carolina that are just now receiving their information. We also have areas that don't have internet access, so they're responding in other formats. That's been a challenge. But you're absolutely right. We have a lot of state government, a lot of federal government people that are reaching out, telling people that this is important. But what folks really need to hear is somebody that they know and trust in their own communities, neighbors, friends, shopkeepers, places that they go to on a regular basis. If they can see information about, we're doing this not necessarily for the United States or for the state of North Carolina, but we're doing it for our community, making sure that everyone here is counted, brings our tax dollars back to serve our needs. That's really the message that we need to get out there. And anybody can help out with that. Unfortunately, COVID meant that a lot of the activities that were planned, we had outreach activities planned around all the public libraries. And unfortunately, with the quarantine, those were closed. So we've had to move a lot of the outreach and promotion, and it's not just the state of North Carolina, but it's also the U.S. Census Bureau, to online outreach, social media. That's a great outreach tool, but again, if someone doesn't have internet access at home, that's not helping them. So any sort of outreach that we have through local media, through if local newspapers can run a quick blip to say, hey, this is important to what we're doing in our community, signs that get stuck in businesses that are open. If you have restaurants that are doing curbside pickup, if they can drop a quick flyer, print it off from census.nc.gov, they could drop a quick flyer in those pickup bags when people come by to grab their to-go orders. That helps. So we all can do a little bit, even if it's just, as we talked about earlier, mentioning to your neighbor, hey, I filled out my census, have you filled yours out? Talking to family members, saying, hey, this is important to everybody. So we do what we can in the middle of this COVID situation. We have until October 31st. Things are beginning to open up more. So we will have more opportunities to have public meetings where we can say, hey, this is important. But until then, let's use the resources like Zoom, like Microsoft Meetings, like listservs, just a regular phone call to let our friends and neighbors know that this is important.
Thank you. We've had a lot of questions about like what are some ideas, and you kind of talked about some of those ideas to reach out to these hard to count communities during COVID. Is there Is there like any other suggestions on how to increase the self-response rate that you can think of outside of those um, recommendations?
Yeah, I would say definitely localized. So in some areas, we've talked about the temporary suspension of field operations that have meant that some areas haven't received their census information yet or are just receiving it now. We also talked about the internet gaps in some communities where households don't have the internet. But we do have some pockets of the state of North Carolina where we have a high degree of seasonal housing units, like on the Outer Banks. A lot of those housing units, people don't live there year round, they're rental facilities, but those are included in the non-response rate. Those places receive census questionnaires, and it's entirely appropriate that people did not send those back in. So those are factored into the initial response rates, but when we get closer to the end of the census cycle, those things get taken into consideration and weeded out. So not all non-response is bad. Some of it is appropriate. What we do know, though, is that there are some folks that may need help in additional languages. We need to let those folks know. We can point them to the 2020 Census website. If you're responding online, you can actually respond online in the same 12 different languages that are available through phone support. So we want to make people know, we want to let people know that if you need help in a specific language, that help is there. We also know that there are some people that don't trust the internet. That's okay. That's why the phone is there. And that's why the paper questionnaires are there as well. So if folks are choosing, if there are folks that want to hold out for that paper form, a lot of those have already been mailed. But the update leave folks and the census workers that are going into the field right now will be bringing you a paper form. So if you feel safer with that response, that's okay. So anyone can respond. We just need you to respond. If you want to preserve that social distance, you need to respond sooner rather than later.
Great, thank you. Another question was, will the mobile vans be available to have on-site assistance provided to residents? And if so, when and how do we schedule that?
There was some original conversation from the Census Bureau about having mobile services available. That was before the COVID situation and the budgetary impacts. I have not heard any discussion from the Census Bureau about those vans being available. However, Governor Cooper did make Wi-Fi hotspots available to local school systems. And the local school systems have the option of putting those hotspots on school buses and driving them into the community where there might be a gap in social and internet coverage. So there is a map that's available, a link to a map that's available from census.nc.gov that will connect you with your local school system if you want to find out exactly where those buses are. It also shows internet hubs within your community. So if you can drive by maybe City Hall and sit in the parking lot and connect to their Wi-Fi, that may be an option for you to be counted online. So mobile vans, I have not heard a confirmed response from the Census Bureau, but the Wi-Fi school buses are available. Check the website, census.nc.gov.
We also have a question about, if I am undocumented and I answer the census, am I putting myself at risk for deportation or being picked up by ICE?
Well, it's important to remember that the census is probably the most democratic thing that is done in the United States. In North Carolina, you have to be 16 to get a driver's license. You have to be 18 to vote. You have to be 21 before you're old enough to drink. But everybody counts on the census. If you're 1 day old or if you're 1,000 days old, you count on the census. It also doesn't matter where you're from. It doesn't matter your citizenship status. If you reside in the state of North Carolina, you count in the state of North Carolina, and we want everyone counted. The Census Bureau is part of the U.S. Department of Commerce. They're not part of a law enforcement agency. And by law, they cannot share your individual census information with any other federal, state, or individual agency at all for 72 years. So your information is protected by law. Title 13 of the U.S. Code says that your information cannot be provided to any other federal agency or state law enforcement agency.
So we have, looks like one more question so far, unless other people would like to add some questions in the chat box. We have a question about college students being counted, and it's kind of like a scenario question. I completed the census online using the code I received in the mail a while ago. One question asked, how many people in your household as of that day? And I stated 4. Where 2 of those counted are my sons who attend different colleges. However, just last week, we were called by the census. They went over our information, making sure everything was correct, and then they asked if any of the 4 people also lived at different addresses. One son attends a North Carolina university and lives in off-campus apartments. Why does the census call us and verify information? How would it be possible for someone to be counted twice in that type of situation?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's a very appropriate question given everything that went on with COVID and the relocation of college students because of campuses closing. So I don't know if you can see behind me on the sign, Census Day is always April 1st of census year. Now that doesn't mean that everybody has to be counted by that date, but that's the reference date by which the census counts people. So when you're responding to your questionnaire, whether it's online, by phone, or on paper, you're answering the question for where you were living as of April 1st. If that's your usual place of residence, that's where you should be counted. Now, college students, if they were in a dorm is considered a group quarters, and they would have been counted through the group quarters process at the college or university, even if they may have been relocated home because of COVID. If they were in off-campus housing at an apartment, their apartment would have received a questionnaire, and they should be counted at that location. The Census Bureau's follow-up with questionnaires that were answered is to work out if there was any duplication, and they have processes on the back end within the Census Bureau to make sure that people aren't counted multiple times. But that's why you got the follow-up call to make sure that the residency rule, where was this person living as of April 1st, even if on April 1st they were at your physical house, but if they normally live somewhere else, they should have been counted at that other location. And that's what they were trying to clarify.
Great. So that is all the questions we received in chat and through our registration form. Are there any other questions that anyone would like to ask in the chat box? So we have one more, it looks like.
While that's coming in, I would like to just clarify on one thing, kind of backing up to questions on confidentiality. There is no question. You may have heard in the year or so leading up to 2020, there were legal cases about the inclusion of a citizenship question on the census. There is no citizenship question on the 2020 census form itself. Now, we talked earlier about other census surveys and operations that they do. There is an American Community Survey that goes to a sample of households every month. There is a citizenship question on the American Community Survey, but it is not on the decennial census, the one that happens every 10 years. And again, that personal information is not shared with anyone. The same privacy rules that govern the census govern all the surveys that the Census Bureau conducts. So any information that you provide cannot be shared with anyone for 72 years.
So some people are confused by the ethnicity question and may not know beyond race. So that's a complicated question. Even for me, when I was looking at that, I completely understand where people are coming from.
Yeah, it's again, I've been doing this for a while. I started with the 1990 census. In 1990, there were actually less race categories than there are now on the 2020 census. And it's interesting if you look at the history of the census that the questionnaire, the operation of the census has changed over time as our communities, as we identify as individuals. As our society changes, the census changes. So now you can respond to as many race categories, as many race options as you feel is appropriate to you. And the same thing with ethnicity. In 1990, you could only be one race. So that's how we've changed just in my time working with the census. So the race question identifies more with a physiological identification. What race do you identify as? And if you look at the question itself, it may say Black or African American. Underneath that, there is a box where you can enter in, well, I'm Nigerian or I'm Haitian. You can write in the specific identity that you have. And there are some examples that the Census Bureau has put in there to sort of give you some clues about the type of information they're looking for. They're asking you how you identify in a racial way. So if you consider yourself Caucasian, are you Irish? Are you German? Are you Polish? You can fill in any information or as much information as you like. If you consider yourself to be Native American, you can input the name of your tribe to make sure that your tribe is properly identified, or any combination of those. So you can be Black and white and Native American and provide as much information as you feel you want to share. Now, all of that is separate from the ethnicity question. The ethnicity question is really asking about Hispanic or non-Hispanic origin. And within that Hispanic origin category, you can also provide some information saying, yes, I am Hispanic or Latino, and I'm Guatemalan, or I'm Spanish or Portuguese. You can identify in any way that you want to. But one is more of a physiological construct, and the other is more of an origin, an ethnic origin construct.
Okay.
Thank you. Are there any more questions from our audience?
Actually, I have one.
Great.
Bob, tell us, why don't they just ask the same questions every 10 years?
Well, what we mentioned a little while ago, the census evolves as our society evolves, and in the past, back in 2020, there were two forms for the census. There was a short form and a long form that ask the same basic questions. There are no questions on either census form or on the census form that we have now. The census can only ask questions that are required for a federal program. So there have been questions like, why don't we ask about transgender folks? That's not an option on the census right now. And the reason is there's not a federal program that requires it. The Census Bureau can ask the question, but it has to be required for a federal program. So if Congress changes things, Congress has to approve the questions that are on the form. So in 2000, as I was saying, there were two questionnaires. The short form only had the 10 basic questions. The long form had 10 basic questions, as well as additional information about questions about your income, your educational attainment, household living arrangements, all that kind of very complex form. And the Census Bureau asked that question to get back to the hard to count communities because they recognize that there's never been a census where we've counted everyone 100%. There's always been people that have been missed. The Census Bureau is a statistical agency, so they've developed some models, and they felt like by using sample information and putting it into their models, they got a more accurate picture of what our communities look like. That went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, that's wonderful. You can use that long form data for everything, but the Constitution requires a count for apportionment in the House of Representatives. So for the purposes of the apportionment, you can only use a short form census. So that's what we have now. We have the 10 basic questions that are required for apportionment. And all that long form question became the American Community Survey, which is done every month. So the census that happens every 10 years sets the foundation. It is the most complete survey that we get, the most complete picture we get of our communities. And that's the foundation for all the estimates that get done for the next 10 years until the next census, not only from the federal level, but also from the state demographer. And that's the money that the $200 per person per year in state funding. That's based on the state demographer's figures, and his estimates are based on the census count. So if we miss people at the census time, we're really hurting ourselves every year for the next 10 years.
Okay, thank you.
So I think we have a clarification question, like where in the Constitution does it say we need to answer all the questions?
The Constitution, I think it's the 6th sentence in the Constitution. So the Founding Fathers made it a very big priority. It's Article 2, I believe, of the Constitution. So what it requires is a count of the total population every 10 years. So it gives the Census Bureau the authority. Now, after that, there's been additional legislation. The information on race and age is required for the Voting Rights Act that came out. So there's additional legislation that happened after the Constitution was published, additional amendments that have tweaked the census requirements, but the authority comes from Article 2.
Thank you. So are there any more questions? Well, it looks like we have no more questions. I would like to thank Bob and Beth for coming here today and to tell us all about the 2020 census. Let me check one more thing. Great. So if you have any more questions or you would like to contact Bob or Elizabeth, their contact information is going to be in chat. Also, if you would like to fill out a response back form, or if you would like to give us any feedback, we'll put in a link there for you just to let us know about this workshop, if there's anything else that you would like from us, or if you have any more questions related to this presentation. Well, thank you all so much, and I hope that y'all have a wonderful day. The link for the feedback will be in the chat box. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Francesca. I would like to point out one more thing. If folks have more interest in the census information, there is a State of the Census workshop happening on the 23rd virtually of this month. It's being hosted by the NC Counts Coalition. They're co-partners with the North Carolina Complete Count Commission. You can visit their website at nccensus.org for more information about that workshop. It's free. But there'll be a wide variety of discussions on various topics, including response rates. And also just to point out that as the census field workers have begun going back into the field right about the first of this month to begin getting those census questionnaires out and getting the census back on track in North Carolina, the North Carolina Complete Count Commission did an analysis of what the non-response as of June 1st would look like to county funding and funding at the congressional district level. So there's a new map with a chart of economic impact at the county and congressional district level that will be going up on the website at census.nc.gov, and that's based on June 1st data. So if you'd like to see what that looks like now, maybe that's an added incentive to help the folks in your community fill out their census. Be looking for that probably by the end of this week.
Great. Thank y'all so much. Y'all have anything else to add before we close out the webinar?
It's not too late to be counted. You can safely be counted at home. Tell your friends, family, anybody that you can see on the street, hey, fill out that census. It's important in North Carolina. It's important in our neighborhood.
Yes, we need to make NC count.
Absolutely.
Thank you all so much, and I hope that you have a great day. And again, if you would like to give us some feedback, we have a link for our feedback website. Thank you so much. You'll have a great day. Bye. Thank you.
Thank y'all. Bye.
Bye.